Welcome back, everybody, to Reason and Theology. I am so excited to say that I am joined by Dr. Craig Blomberg. Here is going to be talking to us about the New Testament manuscripts. Are they reliable? So we're going to be talking about New Testament studies, the manuscripts, textual criticism, all of the above with an absolutely incredible, distinguished professor and scholar, Dr. Blomberg. Welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's such an honor. Absolutely excited. And I might be joined by here in just a little bit my friend Louis Dizon, who is also a fan of your work. And so he'll be joining and asking some questions in just a moment. But I'm just so excited. I want to just dive straight in. Let me maybe start with you by asking, can you just maybe introduce us to what exactly textual criticism is and what that process looks like, how a textual critic might determine what the original autograph and manuscripts actually said?
Well, you just answered the first question. Textual criticism is both a science and an art of doing our best job to our best guess, informed guess at what the original documents, whether of the Bible or any other ancient book where we know we don't have the very first copy that was written. And the way scholars go about that can be divided into two categories. There is what is called external evidence, and that's looking at the manuscript at hand. How old is it? How close was it to the time of the writing of the original? Do we know anything about how well it's been preserved? Was it related to other manuscripts that we have that might have been copied from it, or it copied from them? And then there's what's called internal evidence, and that is to simply ask the question, if we have more than one reading of a particular text, which one is most likely to have produced the others? Oftentimes you're looking for something that a scribe might have thought was a mistake and wanted to clear up. So if something is worded awkwardly, if there seems to be a problem in some detail of the text, if the style doesn't seem quite like what the author does elsewhere, anything that in a scribe's mind might have caused a problem, he is likely to try and smooth out. So a lot more that can be said about both of those areas, but that's it in a nutshell.
So there might be some instances where a scribe is kind of wrestling with perhaps some theological difficulties, at least as they perceive them in the text. And so they might attempt to alter it, perhaps thinking that, surely there's some problem here. And so let me fix it. Maybe I'll give you a perfect example. I'm thinking here about the part of the New Testament where Jesus talks about how, nobody knows the day and the hour of his coming, not even the angels and not even the Son of Man. And
Right.
I think there were some cases there where some scribes looked at that and they thought, wait, how does this work with Jesus's divinity? And so they may have assumed, oh, well, surely this can't be true. And so it seems like in some cases they dropped that out of the text. Is that accurate?
That's a perfect example. Yeah. Why create a problem? Not that it's an insolvable problem, but why even create a problem if you can take care of it in your copying role?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, well, I guess this also brings me to the next question. And by the way, welcome, Louis. He's going to be asking some questions here in just a moment. Um, I want to ask you, what are the earliest manuscripts that we have that um, attest to the New Testament? Can you maybe name some specifically?
We have tiny little fragments that go back to the early to mid second century. The most famous, the oldest known fragment, the so called John Rylands fragment, because it's housed in the John Rylands Museum in Manchester, England, is often dated to about the first quarter of the second century. But all that it has are a few fragments of verses out of the Gospel of John. By the time you get to late in the 2nd century, you start to have close to an entire book, particularly a gospel, particularly Matthew, Luke, and John. The works that have played a hugely disproportionate role in textual criticism really are the 2 nearly complete New Testaments from the 4th century that are known as Codex Vaticanus, because it's been kept in the Vatican Library, and Sinaiticus, because for many centuries it was preserved in a monastery on Mount Sinai, or near the base of Mount Sinai, but now can be seen in the British Library, which is a public museum, and you can see it free of charge. Then there are 3 also nearly complete New Testaments from the 5th century that usually would be seen as the next most important. One is called Alexandrinus. You can see that in the British Library also. One is called Codex Ephremi Rescriptus. And then you have the so-called Western text, or Codex Bezae, which is actually housed in Cambridge at the University Library in Cambridge, England. And then there are more.
When some of these were discovered, maybe in the last century or so, did it significantly change scholars' understanding of the New Testament, or was it pretty much in line with what they had already believed?
The most dramatic discoveries really came in the 19th century, including some of those that I've mentioned. And if you're asking, which at that time it was basically the King James Bible that was the English Bible that everyone read, were there discoveries that helped us to realize that 2 large chunks of the New Testament of 12 verses each, like the story of the woman caught in adultery in John's Gospel, or the so-called longer ending of Mark, most probably weren't what those writers originally wrote? Yeah, that was a revelation. If you're asking overall how much difference did things make, there still are, people will say, anywhere from 97 to 98 to 99% of the New Testament was textually secure already. But interesting little differences in various verses. 1 Thessalonians, does Paul say that he was gentle among them, or does he say he was like babies among them? Well, he was being nice and kind and humble in any event, but the words vary.
Do you think any of these variants could impact doctrine in any kind of meaningful way?
If the question is there any Christian doctrine that depends solely on a disputed text, then the answer is clearly no. And even more skeptical critics, when they're honest, will quickly acknowledge that. People may say something like, oh, look, 1 John has this chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, this reference to the Trinity that was there in the King James, but not in any modern translation of the Bible. All the modern translations must be liberal. Well, no, all the oldest Greek manuscripts don't have it either. Some very pious scribe came along, and in that case, centuries later, before that was added. So does that impinge on a major Christian doctrine? Yeah, it does, the Trinity. But are there any other passages that teach the Trinity if we don't have that one? Yeah, dozens. So it's not any kind of a threat to say that probably isn't what John wrote.
Yeah, and so here I think you're referencing 1 John 5:7-8, the Comma Johannine. I think it ended up finding its way into the Latin Vulgate, if I'm not mistaken. Are there witnesses in the Vulgate?
That's right. It was in the Latin text a long time before it was in any Greek manuscript. There's a very famous story about Erasmus, the Catholic reformer, about half a generation before Martin Luther and the Reformation, who left it out of his best attempt at a critical Greek edition and got so much flack from his Catholic superiors that he rashly vowed, if you can produce one Greek manuscript, not Latin, that has it, I will include it. And surprise, a guy came back not very long afterwards with exactly that document, with all the signs of it having been doctored, but Erasmus was true to his word. He put it in there. And if all you've ever seen is a King James Bible, you would never know it was an issue.
Yeah, right. So in that particular case, it's likely that the Greek manuscript was not authentic.
Correct.
Yeah. there's some fascinating cases, I think, even with the last few verses of the book of Revelation in the KJV, and how that was just completely inserted into the text without any kind of manuscript witnesses, if I recall correctly.
Well, the other big one, referring to endings of books, is the 12 verses that have become known as Mark 16, 9-20, which personally, since they include promises like picking up snakes and drinking their venom without being harmed, I'm glad I don't feel bound to say that is inerrant authoritative scripture.
There's a whole bunch of Appalachian preachers, right? The snake handlers who probably, would be upset if they found out
West
that
Virginia is still the one state in the union where it's legal to have snake handling in church.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, because of that. Okay, so I got one more question, then I want to pass it over here to Lewis, who's going to ask way more insightful questions than I will be able to. So let me ask you this. All right. With the manuscript witnesses that we have today, how can we be confident that they go back to the autographs and original readings? Because from what I've heard from critics, they'll point out that it could be that these readings and the process of textual criticism is bringing us back to a source, but it might not be the original source. It might be some copy that may have retained some things and maybe even many things from the original autograph, but may also still contain some deviations and corruptions, and therefore the whole process of textual criticism might not be going back to the original autographs, but might be going back to something that was copied a little bit later. What might you say in response to that?
I will quote my good friend Dan Wallace, who has taught at Dallas Seminary for several decades and maybe evangelicalism's leading North American textual scholar. He will take a Greek New Testament, which has copious footnotes in it with the most important textual variants, and he will like to shock audiences by holding it up and saying, actually, we have the autographs right here, except we don't always know if it's in the text or in the footnotes. There is so much textual evidence that the chances that an original reading, what one of the Bible writers first wrote, was never preserved by anybody anywhere is just microscopically small. The way that the Bibles were copied was not that there was one central text that somebody copied from it and another from it and another from it. It was such a diverse and varied process that with the thousands of manuscripts available, we have the originals. It's just debated, and rightly so. In some cases, we're not absolutely sure which version is the original.
And shout out to Dr. Dan Wallace. We had him on the show a few years back. Y'all go and check out that episode. So, I mean, one other follow-up question before I pass it over to Lewis. So, what would you actually consider to be an original, for example, of an epistle of Paul or something? Is the original that which he verbally dictated, or is it that which maybe a scribe, a secretary listening to Paul wrote down, or would it be maybe perhaps another edition of what Paul wrote down or something? What would you consider to be originals when it comes to the New Testament?
This too has been debated in some circles, but the most common understanding by far throughout the history of the church of what people are looking for is what probably a scribe in many cases putting ink to papyrus first wrote and then was delivered to the audience that was going to read it. It is very likely that many, perhaps all, of the books were dictated. We know that in the case of Romans, where Paul mentions the scribe, a man named Tertius. We know that the process of dictation regularly involved the author going over with the scribe what was written to make sure it fully conformed to what the author wanted to have written. There would be no way we could ever recover Paul's oral musings. No, let me put it this way, Tertius. But we have to go with what we assume was written down. There are people that sometimes say, well, can we be sure there was one original? How else would things have gotten started?
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you so much. All right, so hey, Lewis, go ahead and jump in here with your questions. You have some really, really good stuff for Dr. Blomberg, so looking forward to this.
Yes. Actually, I had a bunch of questions that are not related to textual criticism, so I decided to junk those and come up with a new set. Also, Dr. Blomberg, before I begin, I want to mention that it's great to see you again. I don't know if you remember, but we actually met many years ago at an apologetics conference in Canada back in 2016, and I had you sign a couple of my books. So your work has been very helpful to me when it comes to dealing with matters pertaining to New Testament reliability.
Was that in the Toronto area?
It was in Mississauga. There was
north of there. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I did both of those on the same trip. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I see your flag, so you're doing well there.
Yep, we're doing
well.
I'm
glad you have no desire to become our 51st state.
Yeah. Well, that's a sticky topic up here. But I do have some questions relating to New Testament textual transmission. And
let me say, they don't have to be limited to them, because I was told you might talk very widely.
Sure. I'll try to focus on the text critical ones first, though. I want to start off by building on a previous point that you made, that to do with the disputed texts in the longer ending of Mark, such as "and the woman caught in adultery." Now, I know that there's a significant minority of scholars who hold to what is known as Byzantine priority. So, for example, there's Maurice Robinson and William Pierpont, and they have their own edition of the Greek New Testament, and they would argue that the overemphasis on the Alexandrian and Western text types has led us to rashly throw out some of these variants. But if we were to give more consideration to the Byzantine text, since that is the majority, then a greater case to be made. There is a greater case to be made that we could include those disputed texts as part of the original. I want to get your thoughts on the whole Byzantine priority movement and their arguments for the longer ending and the woman caught in adultery.
It's true that there have been 2 or 3 bona fide scholars, Robinson being one of them, who have made this case. It's true that when you say a significant minority, if by that you mean that the scholars are significant, yes, they are. If you mean that the minority is a significant minority, no, it is less than 1% of all the textual critics in the world. That line of thinking has not convinced the vast majority of people. Is it true that about 80% of the texts are from what is called the Byzantine family, which is a name that came from the fact that they were either created or preserved or discovered or copied from manuscripts from the area of ancient Byzantium, which later became Constantinople, which later became Istanbul in Turkey? Yes, that's true. But there is, as Don Carson has put it in his little book on the King James Version only debate, there's a very obvious reason why 80% of the manuscripts are from that area. Byzantium and the Byzantine Empire was the heart of Greek Orthodoxy and then other forms of Orthodoxy, which made up the eastern half of the Christian world for a number of centuries. And it was these centuries when the most number of texts of the New Testament, at least that we're aware of, were being copied and being preserved. So it would be like saying, wow, there's an amazing amount of works about the founding of the American government, and they're all found in Washington. Well, yeah, that's exactly where we would expect it to be. So with all proper respect to people who hold that view, I don't.
Okay. Now, proponents of that theory might argue that, well, the reason most scholars reject, let's say, the longer ending is on the basis of, say, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. But we have a number of other manuscripts that are from roughly the same time period, or maybe even earlier, that do contain the longer ending. And then we also have the witness of various early church fathers who quoted parts of the longer ending in their writings. So how would you respond to someone who would bring up those pieces of evidence?
It's true that in my opening comments about external and internal criticism, it's not simply one or the other, and it's never as simple as find the oldest manuscript and it will always be better than later manuscripts, because I can have something that I write and I can have people copy it for years and do a very good job. And then if all of the earlier copies are lost, you have a good copy that is later. And I can write something and have somebody butcher a copy and have it be copied. And then I can have something that's earlier, if all those things are preserved, that's not as accurate. But overall, as we compare Sinaiticus and Vaticanus with the other major witnesses, when those two agree, that is routinely recognized as something to take into consideration seriously. There are places where their witness is rejected, and it's not simply on that basis. For me, it's probably more the internal than the external evidence that is convincing for John 7:53 to 8:11, because it is not related to the context. Everything else in John 7 and 8 deals with Jesus at the Feast of Tabernacles. It is not written in entirely John's typical style of Greek. It has quite a number of textual variants itself, far more than you find any place else in a passage of that length. And you can understand the debate over whether that should be included or not. Do we want to have a Jesus who forgives sinners in such a blanket fashion? What's fascinating is there are critical scholars who say this is almost certainly a true story. I suspect it was. I suspect it was something that happened. And so we have to remember that saying something is in an original manuscript of the Bible is not saying those are the only possible things that could be true. John himself, towards the end of his gospel, says the whole world couldn't contain the books that would need to be written if we put down everything that Jesus did. So saying that it wasn't in John's original doesn't by any means mean that that's not a historical incident. It just doesn't seem to be what John first wrote.
Thank you very much. Now, you actually mentioned something that I wanted to get your thoughts on as well, and it has to do with balancing internal versus external evidence. So, one of the things that I notice whenever I read, say, Metzger's textual commentary on the Greek New Testament is sometimes he'll say that the external evidence might favor one reading, but the internal evidence will favor another. I was doing a study on Romans 5:1, for example, not that long ago, and it mentions that whereas echomen with the omega is favored
Yep.
by the external evidence, the internal evidence favors echomen with an omicron, and the committee favored this latter reading on the basis of the internal evidence. So, like, my question, I guess, would be, how would you balance the considerations of external versus internal evidence, and what do you think of the committee's choice of echomen versus echomen in the particular case of Romans 5:1?
It would be wonderful if we had a formula of agreed on principles that everybody could follow. Let's take 38% external, 42% internal. Anything a given committee agrees on unanimously makes up the rest. Human nature will never create anything like that. If AI does, we should be suspicious of it. Romans 5, in virtually every English translation I've ever looked at, says something like, therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have, echomen, peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Paul is writing what may be his most organized and structured and elaborate statement of the Christian gospel and of Christian theology. And just about anybody who has ever looked at it in any detail will say the first 11 chapters are chapters of doctrine. Chapters 12 to the end, minus the closing greetings, are commands. They are ethical imperatives that flow from the gospel. It would be completely out of Paul's style to suddenly say here in a section that is teaching the results of justification by faith, to suddenly use the subjunctive, which would be translated, let us have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. It would also be out of sync with his emphasis, without swinging the pendulum to a completely reformed perspective. It would be out of keeping with him to suddenly say, oh, we can create this peace with God. No, the very next verse, where there's no textual variant, says, we have also obtained access through him by faith into this grace. It's talking about what Christ's death on the cross for us has accomplished. This is one of those cases where textual critics go against Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. It's one that when for many years I taught Romans in Greek to my students, I would stop and call their attention to. It doesn't happen very often. Let's look at what's going on here and let's understand why. The internal evidence, the likelihood that Paul suddenly interrupted a coherent narrative of what God in Christ has done for us through the atonement and suddenly lapsed into, let us do something, is just very minuscule. But does that mean that every time I have a similar phenomenon, I've got a formula that I can follow? No, there may be other mitigating factors that there aren't in this case. And that's why I started out answering the question, what is textual criticism, by saying it's an art as well as a science. and there will be people who always disagree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I do have a couple of sub comments relating to that. One has to do with um, internal considerations as a whole. One of the criticisms that I've often heard about internal criticisms is that a lot of times involves trying to psychologize what the scribe might be thinking, like, oh, maybe they consciously decided to edit a text, or maybe they had a lapse and um, decided to, and left something out by accident. But like with any other things that involve psychology, it's very subjective. I find that when we're considering external evidence, because we're relying on actual physical manuscripts, it's a lot less prone to that kind of subjectivity. My second sub comment has to do with Romans 5:1 specifically. Somebody who might favor the subjunctive echomen could argue that you could interpret it in a way that flows with the rest of Paul's arguments. Like maybe I've heard one commentary say that "let us have peace with God" could be understood to mean "let us manifest the peace that God has given us."
Well, to answer your second question first, this is hardly a passage where any significant doctrine is at stake. If there was good reason to say this is what Paul wrote, yeah, we can probably find a way to make sense of it, to make it fit. We're not claiming that there's only one right way to make sense of the passage. We're just saying on probability grounds, which seems more likely. In terms of subjectivity of internal evidence, there are some examples of that. There are times when, I think Mark Goodacre at Duke University, and he will do this with the theological emphases of a gospel and the way they edited or redacted their material, which has some interesting parallels to the behavior of textual critics. And he will talk about editorial or scribal fatigue. Well, here's a pattern I think I see, but I don't see it here, here, and here. And instead of allowing that to count against my hypothesis, I'll just say somebody was inconsistent. They were getting tired. It's kind of like I would love someday to research this, but never have. This is the exception that proves the rule. That has to be one of the most absurd sayings that anybody has ever invented. If it's an exception, it counts against the rule. Now, maybe you can explain the exception. 100% perfect rules are hard to follow. A single exception may not throw out the rule, but the idea that finding an exception somehow proves a rule, it might prove that three people who claim to see the same thing and use the identical words page on end, but there were a few exceptions. Okay, they weren't in collusion at that point, but that's a very narrow example. When it comes to textual evidence, it's beyond a shadow of a doubt, I think, that in general, scribes tried to move in the direction of clarifying, of getting rid of that which was awkward, of avoiding theological problems. That's not psychologizing. That's not trying to enter into the mental state of a dead person from some long time ago. That's simply observing what we have seen with non-religious and religious books from many ancient cultures all around the world as a general pattern that has exceptions, but more often than not, it's exactly what scribes do.
Yes. So moving on, I want to switch tracks now to the topic of the Orthodox corruption of Scripture. Now, Bart Ehrman famously wrote a book with that
Yep.
title, and his thesis was that during the early Christological debates, certain theologically motivated scribes may have consciously edited New Testament manuscripts in order to make them conform to orthodoxy and eliminate readings that might suggest heretical Christology, such as adoptionism. Now, my question is, do you think there is merit to Ehrman's argument in the Orthodox corruption of Scripture?
I think there's merit to a lot of it. It's simply a matter of observation. If you do something as simple as look at manuscripts that were created in the second millennium, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, compared to ones 1,000 years earlier or so, simply the use of titles for Jesus. More often than not, Jesus becomes Jesus Christ or Christ Jesus, and Jesus Christ becomes the Lord Jesus Christ or Jesus Christ the Lord. In a simple example like that, the idea to exalt and magnify the name of Jesus by adding a title in a later manuscript seems indisputable. When he starts to talk about heretical readings, I think he reads in heresy too quickly. I don't find some of the examples that he discusses. We already mentioned not even the Son in Jesus' prediction of who knows the time of his return. That's not an issue of heresy, though somebody could casually make such a claim, because Jesus limited himself in not having the ability to be omnipresent. There were never any sightings of Jesus in two different cities at the same time on the same day. He certainly, we're told in Mark 6 that he could do few miracles in Nazareth because of their unbelief. And that doesn't mean he was physically unable to do them, but he consciously limited himself because of their lack of faith. So why not a voluntary limitation on his omniscience? And the caveat that theologians have made over the centuries is, except when it was God's will for him to be able to rely on those uniquely divine attributes. There are times when I think Bart takes the issue too far, and we'd have to go through and discuss those one at a time. I didn't know this question was going to come up, so I don't have a memorized list of his examples at the top of my head. I know one that I like that other people have sometimes disputed, and that's in Mark chapter 1, when Jesus is encountering a demon-possessed individual. And
Is it the one where he says deeply moved versus angered?
exactly. Do you have the verse reference there?
Yes. I know it's in the first chapter.
141, yes.
Yeah.
Is it moved with compassion, or is it moved with indignation? Well, it's a complex issue, but the main point Ehrman wants to make is it would make sense for a scribe to say what the parallel accounts say, namely that Jesus was moved with compassion. And it could be awkward for an early Christian to think of Jesus being indignant. I don't know why that would have to be, but I guess throughout the history of the church, we like to have Jesus going around being nice more than ever getting upset. And so on internal grounds, I think a strong case can be made for the word, which is very similar, being that he was indignant. It gets more complicated when you look to the external text, because the evidence, because there is some very strong early evidence for moved with compassion. But I have no problems with Bart raising that question in that instance. I think it's the kind of question we ought to talk about.
Yeah. Although I do find it funny when Ehrman argues that this changes the picture of Jesus in Mark gospel, because
Yeah,
Jesus gets angry other places in the same gospel.
exactly. And he gets really angry in Matthew at the scribes and Pharisees in the temple at the end of his life.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Mark's Jesus is kind of mild-mannered relative to Matthew's Jesus, funny enough.
Except when he's encountering demon-possessed people. Read the example in chapter 5. I mean, Mark
True.
1 is calm in comparison.
Mm-hmm. Now, on the topic of Christology and textual variants, there is one case where I think going back to the earlier witnesses seems to yield a text with a higher Christology. And I have in mind specifically Jude, verse 5. Now, for the longest time, the fifth verse of Jude had Kyrios in it, the Lord. But in the latest edition of the Nestle Allen text, the 28th edition, it actually says Jesus now, which actually puts it in line with a number of other witnesses, such as the Vulgate. And I've actually, I think about this, and it seems like if you read Jesus there instead of Lord, that basically implies that Jesus is the God of the Exodus, which would furnish like an explicit affirmation of Jesus' deity. I pointed this out actually to one of my Unitarian friends not that long ago. So my question, I guess, would be, do you think that the change from Kyrios to Jesus in the latest edition of the Nestle Allen text, in this case, is a warranted change? And do you think that we can make a good theological argument that this variant produces good evidence for the deity of Christ?
I think it's easier to answer the second of those questions. If that is the original, then it certainly would favor the deity of Christ. I think one way to defend it is to look at some of the other non-Pauline epistles and see places where it sounds like Christ is doing something in the Old Testament, or the gospel was preached to Abraham. Well, is that just good news, or is that something more overtly Christological? When you look at little places in Paul, every one of them disputed by somebody, but you have Jesus, who is God, blessed over all forever, amen, stuck into Romans 9:5. You have a reference in Titus 2. I think the case that there may be a handful of more explicit statements about Jesus as God in the New Testament than everybody has recognized is something worth considering. Second Peter has at the beginning, and Second Peter is maybe the closest book in the New Testament content-wise to Jude, and he says in the opening verse, to those who have received a faith equal to ours through the righteousness of our God and Savior, Jesus Christ. And grammatically, I think the strongest way of understanding that, the best way of understanding that, is that Jesus is being called God as well as Savior. Did Nestle Aland make the right decision there? That is a hornet's nest of problems. I have not researched that nearly as much as some other textual problems that we have. I'm not against it, but I don't know that I've done enough work that I should come out on record in saying, yeah, absolutely, I support it.
Yeah. One of the interesting things I do want to note is I believe Metzger back in the 90s argued for that reading long before the NA28 editors decided to put it in. So I guess he was ahead of his time in that particular case.
He was ahead of his time in a lot of things.
Yeah, true. Now, when it comes to the NA28, there is one thing that I've noticed when comparing the NA28 to other critical editions of the Greek New Testament, and that is its use of conjectural emendations. There's two places I can recall in the NA28 where they use conjectural emendation. Like they decide that none of the manuscripts have the correct reading, so they try to infer what it is. I don't remember off the top of my head, except that one is in Acts and the other is in one of St. Peter's epistles. Now, I looked at the SBL Greek New Testament as well as the Cambridge Greek New Testament, and they don't use conjectural emendation in those two places. So I guess my question relating to that is, do you think conjectural emendation is ever necessary to determine the original reading at any point in the Greek New Testament?
I'm not sure that it is. I've not looked at those either, so I don't want to speak off the cuff. I know from my Old Testament scholarly friends that there are times in the Old Testament, no matter how conservative we try to hold to the Masoretic text, that they feel sometimes we've got a mistake. We think there's a way we can see how it developed, even though we don't have a manuscript that has it exactly that way. But we are on much more secure footing with the New Testament, and I'm not sure that that's sort of a counsel of despair as a very last resort, and I'm not sure we're ever pushed that far.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree on that point. Now, another question I have regarding the dating of manuscripts. So, we use stuff like carbon dating and paleography to try to determine when to date certain manuscripts, but I know that some scholars have questioned the accuracy of such means. So, for example, it's long been said that the earliest manuscript that we have of any New Testament document is P52, which contains part of the Gospel of John. And I've often heard it said that you can date it to maybe somewhere between AD 100 and 150. But I've recently heard that there are some scholars, such as Brent Nongbury in God's Library, who would argue that actually we can't securely date P52 or many other similar manuscripts to the date that has traditionally been assigned to them. So we can't rule out P52 being later than what has been claimed for it. Would you agree with this assessment, and how that impact the argument for the reliability of these New Testament manuscripts?
I don't think I would agree. No. Brent has made a career out of taking textually unpopular and not highly agreed upon positions. Two of my good friends have produced an amazingly wonderful book that is not technical at all. Elijah Hickson and Peter Gurry on mistakes that apologists frequently make about New Testament textual criticism. And unfortunately, I appear in there a couple of times, once when I deserved to because I didn't express myself at all clearly, and another place where we've just agreed to disagree. But they do say that we need to be more cautious than some books I have read that will say we can date P52 to 125, or we can date P52 to 140. If we want to be extremely fair and not overstate things, they actually say we should talk about 100 to 150. And if you come up with an average, well, you do come up with 125, so that might be more likely than the extreme ends of that period of time. But yes, there is caution, especially with carbon-14. People that have studied this far more than I will say. You can get to pretty confidently within 50 years, and sometimes even more so, more closely than that. Paleography, another area that I have to rely on the experts to talk about, handwriting analysis. I have certainly watched in my lifetime, and given the fact that when I was little, my grandmother and some of her siblings, my great aunts and uncles, did something very old-fashioned called writing letters by hand with cursive. I can trace a change in American cursive. Of course, now the change is people aren't even learning it. But those who have studied the scribal tendencies will also say we can often get to within 50 years. We can regularly get to within 100 years because of how, in small ways, letters were formed differently as handwriting and printing evolved. But does that mean we need to suddenly have all kinds of doubts about the process? I don't see any reason for that.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding correctly, we can determine using paleography that there's a certain range of dates, but there's always going to be a margin of error within
Sure.
that range. Okay, that is fair. The remaining question that I have are related to the New Testament and its reliability more broadly.
That's fine.
All right.
That's
So
what I
here's
thought I was going to be dealing with.
yeah, same here. So one of the topics that I've always been really interested in is the topic of how to resolve apparent contradictions in the Gospels. And in the Christian apologetics community, there is a long-standing debate over that and how to do it. So Mike Licona wrote a couple of books on using literary devices on gospel difficulties, or using on resolving gospel difficulties. And I
Right.
know that you have a review of said book. And also, Lydia McGrew famously or infamously wrote a response to it, claiming that Lycona's use of literary devices is illegitimate, and actually, rather than bolstering the authenticity of the Gospels, actually undermines it. Now, I'm curious to know where you land on the whole debate over literary devices and their legitimacy in resolving those apparent contradictions.
It's so easy in questions like these to go to one side or the other and avoid all the hard work of looking at actual passages. I think Mike is right part of the time. I think he's wrong part of the time. I think Lydia's right part of the time. I think she's wrong part of the time. And I don't think either scholar has done themselves a service by trying to say literary devices answer everything or literary devices answer nothing. One of the most helpful things that Licona has pointed out that apologists have been noting through the centuries is that there are times when one gospel refers to a single individual present, speaking, doing something, and parallel accounts have multiple people, whether it's two blind men healed versus one, and we know his name, Bartimaeus, whether it's two angels at the tomb versus one, or one who is described as a young man with resplendent garments. It was extremely common, and nobody needed Licona's research to know this, but he popularized it very helpfully, that it was very common to what he calls to a flashlight approach. You don't need to mention how many people were involved in something when there is one key actor or speaker in the group. So there's a case where I would say, yeah, stress that. the critics that think that it's automatically a contradiction every time you have 1 versus 2 are using a kind of modern standard of precision that nobody in the ancient world ever dreamed of.
Mm-hmm.
When he says, well, after the feeding of the 5,000, the walking on the water, the disciples were crossing the lake. And here the problem is between Mark and John. Did they set out for Bethsaida or did they set out for Capernaum? And if you look at a map of the northern shore of Galilee and the weather is stormy, you're going to hug the coastline rather than going out into the open sea, and you'll come to Bethsaida and you'll keep going and you'll come to Capernaum. And I don't see any reason why one of them shouldn't have, one gospel writer shouldn't have referred to the first port of call, and the other gospel writer should have referred to where they eventually wanted to get to. As it turned out, neither worked. They wound up blown off course and down by Magdala instead. Mike thinks we've talked about that at length in person, and he just thinks that's I'm grasping at straws, and it's like, why? This is what happens when people describe events. But he says no, it was a literary device. You look at Plutarch, there are times when he's telling a story of the same event in 2 of his separate biographies because the people overlap in time and place, and the name of a person, the name of a place just changes. We don't really know why. Apparently nobody cared. Well, maybe we don't know why because we don't have enough information yet. Maybe Plutarch did make a mistake. Just because he did doesn't mean another author did. And what about undesigned coincidences? If you want to draw scorn from the academy, make the suggestion that Jesus might have done something in the temple, both at the beginning and the end of his ministry. And my goodness, even though a lot of the details in John 2 and Mark 14 are quite different, one of the fascinating things, and again, it wasn't Lydia who first pointed it out, she's just helped to popularize it, is why was Jesus arrested and tried when it says they sought false testimony? Of all the false things in the world that you could make up, well, Jesus actually led a double life. He had 6 women on the side. And I mean, so many things you could have imagined. Why was the convincing, though false charge, finally he claimed he would destroy this temple in 3 days and rebuild it? Well, there's nothing in Mark 14 to suggest he said anything like that. But it's very similar to what John 2 claims that he said 2 or 3 years earlier, except what he said was, you destroy this temple and I will raise it in 3 days. And then John says nobody understood what he meant. And only after the resurrection, and then only the disciples realized he was talking about the temple of his body. Okay, they didn't understand it then. It could have gotten garbled in transmission very easily. That's the point of Mark, is not to tell us that Jesus made a mess out of the temple twice, but is that an undesigned coincidence to suggest that maybe he did? Maybe it is. I like Mike. I like Lydia. I think each of them takes a horse and runs with it too far.
Yeah, actually, I'm inclined to agree with you on the whole temple incident, because I don't know why some people have such trouble believing that Jesus could have cleared the temple twice. Jesus does things does repeated versions of the same thing all the time. Like he feeds thousands of people using a few loaves twice in the Gospels, and sometimes they're mentioned twice within the same Gospel. So to me, it's no stretch to think that Jesus could have cleared the money changers out of the temple two different times in his ministry.
The complaint that makes that different from the other examples is the complaint that no way would the Jewish authorities, and if they didn't do it, no way would Rome have allowed him to do that without taking intervening action. Nobody has to punish somebody for miraculously doing something nice two different times. But would he have been allowed to get away with that? Randy Richards came up with a little article in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society not too many years ago that said there is a way to make sense of that. The first episode would have been so unique and so unusual and would have brought to Jesus in the eyes of observers a level of public shame that itself would have been viewed by them as enough punishment to deter him from ever doing anything like that again. But if he did, then the authorities would have to intervene. It's an interesting argument.
Makes sense. Yeah. Now, let's see. I have one. Okay, I have one more set of questions. This to do with dating the Gospels as well as the relationship of the Gospels to each other. So actually, I'll do like dating the Gospels first. The common consensus among a lot of New Testament scholars is that you would date Mark in maybe like the 60s AD, Matthew and Mark around the 70s or 80s AD, and then John in the 90s. But I know that there's some conservative scholars who have pushed back on that, arguing for earlier dates. Maybe the synoptic gospels are all pre-70, and maybe even all four gospels are pre-70. I want to get your thoughts on why is it that majority of scholars opt to date the gospels late, and do you think that a solid case can be made for dating the gospels earlier than they normally would?
That's probably the most challenging question I've been asked in a long time in order to give a very short answer to. I think you said Matthew and Mark when you meant to say Matthew and Luke in
Yeah,
the
Matthew, Luke,
80s.
yes.
The short answer is I think the synoptics can be dated to the 60s. I've said this and defended it in several of my publications. Luke, because I think it's still the best explanation of why he ends Acts where he does, with Paul still in house arrest in Rome and no mention of what happened with his appeal to Nero, which means it can't be later than 62. Mark then would have to be earlier because I believe Luke used Mark. Matthew, if we go to one of the oldest external traditions from Irenaeus in the 2nd century, who says that Matthew wrote while Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel in Rome. And we know that both of them were martyred in the mid-60s. So I don't think there's a direct relationship between Matthew and Luke, the second part of your question. So we can still have Matthew in the early to mid-60s. Reasons for skepticism range from the apparent clarity of Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple in AD 70, which those who are inclined to a form of naturalism that doesn't allow for predictive prophecy would then say, well, this shows it had to happen and have been done later. There are questions related to the communities to which each author wrote, how much we can know or infer about their circumstances and whether that requires a post-70 dating, but I don't see that as being necessary. Once you get on the bandwagon and date Matthew, Mark, and Luke to the 60s, well, gee, can we do that with John also? There are people who have tried. I think Richard Bauckham has done a very good job in his work to say there's all kinds of signs, even though John doesn't come out and say in so many words that the temple is no longer standing. The point of a gospel is to tell the story of Jesus, not to tell history of what happened 30 years later. The external tradition, not as strong as for some of the other gospels, but would also put John in the 90s. I think we can make good sense of the end of the gospel. Didn't Jesus say John was going to live until he returned, and now he's just died? And is that an issue? I think that explains why an editor comes along and ends the gospel the way he does, to say, no, that's actually not what Jesus promised. He just said, what if this should happen? That he would remain until I come. So I don't see any need to date John earlier than the 90s, which is still 2 generations from the death of Jesus, remarkably early by ancient standards for what we have for most other biographies of anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find it odd, though, that people will use the destruction of the temple as an argument to date Matthew and Luke post 70, because Mark also has Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple, and that doesn't prevent those same scholars from dating Mark to the 60s. So we're still, even using the late dating, we're still left with a bona fide prediction of the destruction of the temple.
There would be some, not as many today as a generation ago, but certainly when I was in college at not at an evangelical college, it was assumed that Mark was written in the 70s and after the destruction of the temple. So that's there as well.
Right. On that note, since we're talking about the dating and the relationships of the Gospels, I want to get your thoughts on the best way to resolve the synoptic problem, because I know the most common theory, of course, is that Mark came first, and that Matthew and Luke were both dependent on Mark, and they were also dependent on the Q source. But there's also alternative theories besides that. Do you think that the majority theory is the best way to explain the synoptic problem, or would you be inclined to a different solution?
I do. Back in the days of my PhD work with a man named Howard Marshall, University of Aberdeen, who had just written a major commentary on Luke at the time. He had done very painstaking work in that respect, and I like his approach, and that is to say, one of the reasons Q has gotten a bad press is because people have run with it and assumed not only that they can reconstruct its exact contents with a high degree of accuracy, but then they can envision a Q community of people who might have produced it, who might have found it as their most authoritative source. Q does not have a passion narrative. It doesn't have resurrection story. So therefore, these are people who didn't believe in Jesus' atoning death or resurrection. All kinds of wild stuff. If we limit ourselves to the facts that we have existing examples from Jewish and Greek and Roman and apocryphal Christian documents of lists of the most beloved sayings of famous philosophers and religious leaders, it would make all the sense in the world for somebody, maybe several somebodies, to have created such lists, which is, with a few exceptions, pretty much what Q boils down to, that which is common to Matthew and Luke, but not found in Mark. And it would be surprising if something like that had never been created for Jesus. Do I imagine being martyred for the Q hypothesis? Never. there are people who argue strongly for Matthew's direct dependence on Luke, or more commonly, vice versa. There was a man who, for a full generation, from the 1960s to the 2000s, promoted something called the Griesbach hypothesis. William Farmer, who put Mark as the last of the three, who was an epitomizer. And he promoted that theory so widely, he gathered scholars for international conferences for 40 years, that if you didn't believe in Markan priority, Farmer's hypothesis was your next best shot. He died in his 70s, not far into his 70s, if I recall right, and his theory jumped off a cliff. You don't hear about it from anyone anymore. There are, fortunately, several people, including Mark Goodacre, who are keeping the idea of dispensing with Q alive. I don't expect to see that die a death as dramatically when one scholar dies, but it still is a distant second, and I think rightly so.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Yeah, my understanding is, Matthew and Luke must definitely have been reliant on a common source. Now, one of the things that I'm a little less certain of is if Q had to be a single discrete document.
I agree.
Could it have been like multiple documents, or maybe even like an oral tradition?
Yep.
Could Q have been an oral source?
And Marshall made a big deal of all of those options in his commentary, and I would agree.
Uh-huh. Okay. I have just one last question. This one was asked in the chat box, and it has to do with pseudepigraphy in the New Testament. Like how plausible is it, the theory that some of the authors, they were writing in someone else's name, and then it was just accepted that way? Because I believe Bart Ehrman in Forged argued that pseudepigraphy was not accepted in the early Christian community. Like, as soon as it was found out that a document had been written by someone else, it was immediately thrown out, which would create problems if, in fact, some of the New Testament books were pseudepigraphal.
It's fascinating. I don't recommend growing old. There aren't a lot of advantages to it, but I mean, the alternatives might be less pleasant. One of the things that happens when you are around a field for, going on 50 years, is you see exact opposite trends being promoted with the same level of confidence and sometimes with the same arguments. When I was a student, every liberal critic who talked about pseudepigraphy said, this is not forgery. No one is making that claim. This is what we can see some people having done with Cicero's letters, what we can see the rabbis in the Mishnah talking about a pupil writing in the name of his teacher. This was an accepted, dare I use the word, literary device that people would have seen as innocuous as when you see the autobiography of a famous sports star or celebrity, and then you read the fine print as told to, or you discover that there was a ghostwriter. And evangelicals looked into this and they said, yeah, there's little bits of evidence for it, but in Christian circles, and we can't get back to anything much earlier than the mid-2nd century, but every time they found out or believed they had found out that a document was pseudepigraphical, then they rejected that as out of hand, as not worth considering as an authoritative document for their community. And I think, here's my reading of history, what happened was we finally said that often enough and long enough that the critical establishment said, oh, maybe you're right. Well, then I guess they were all forgeries. Is there a third possibility? Like maybe they actually came from the people it was said wrote them, and that the evidence for pseudepigraphy isn't as strong as you've been claiming?
Mm-hmm. Good thought. Yeah, I'm still going back and forth on this. I'm inclined to believe that whenever a New Testament document is written by the person in the first verse, that really is the person who wrote it. So that means Saint Peter, in other words, really did write 2 epistles in his name,
Right.
although that is contested nowadays in a lot of circles. Um, so, if I'm understanding you correctly, there is a case to be made that even if St. Peter didn't write those 2 epistles, that doesn't necessarily mean that the early Christians necessarily would have rejected them. Am I understanding correctly?
I would say there's an outside chance that that would be the case, but I would think it would be very unlikely. But if I can guess where you're leading up to, we do have to distinguish manuscripts that have authors' names at the beginning and what has come to be called the first verse from those that do not have any claims to authorship at all. So when we get to the 4 Gospels, you don't have the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John at the beginning anywhere. And it may well be that if by anonymity, something being anonymous, all that means is the document doesn't claim to have been written by anybody, that is a fair description of the 4 Gospels. Is it likely that when they were each written apart from one another, that they would have all chosen the identical title to be put prior to the actual text of the gospel, to euangelion kata ton, followed by the author's name, the gospel according to this person? Or is it more likely that that's what someone in the church did when they first collected the 4 documents into a 4 gospel collection, and there was a need to distinguish one from another, and it made sense to use the identical style of title for each of the 4? To me, that seems a more plausible explanation. Does that mean that those titles are untrustworthy? No, not at all. There still may be a very good case to be made for saying Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote them. Just saying that within the text of the writing itself, there isn't a claim made one way or the other.
And Dr. Blomberg, I do see some chat questions here. If it's okay, if we just grab just a few of those.
Sure,
do you have
let's
just a
do
few
it.
moments? Okay.
I'm glad you're getting to talk.
Yeah, I really appreciate your time and your generosity and your expertise. So thank you so much. So here's something from Fight League. Could Q have been the saying of Jesus written by Matthew in Aramaic?
I have suggested that very cautiously in several places, and there have been a handful of scholars who have said that before me. I recognize it's a guess. It's very tentative. But given that there was this recurring tradition in the early church fathers that Matthew wrote something that was called the logia, the sayings of Jesus, in a Hebrew or Aramaic tongue, it certainly seems like an option that we should keep on the table.
There's another question here for clarification. I think one of the questioners is asking, do you believe that Peter wrote Second Peter?
It's interesting because that's the one document and the only one out of the 27 that was debated even in the early church. Now, Hebrews was debated because there's no claim anywhere, even in titles, of an author. But for the books that eventually came to have titles or that had authorship claims in the text, there was debate even in the early church. So you can't blame modern skeptical liberal critics for that one. There is no question that the style of First and Second Peter, First Peter is, if you've had 3 semesters of Greek, I regularly taught a Greek elective on First Peter, and by 4th semester, students can do a good job with it. Second Peter kills people. It is bizarre. Ben Witherington has made a case that Peter deliberately adopted something called Asiatic rhetoric, a high, flowery style. I'm not enough of an expert in Asiatic rhetoric to know what I think of that. For a long time, the suggestion was made that because First Peter 5 says that it was with the help of Silas, or Silvanus to use his full name, that Peter wrote the letter, that meant Peter had a scribe, had an amanuensis that he dictated First Peter 2, but said, now put this in good Greek style, please. And he didn't have one for Second Peter, and well, that's about the best Jewish fisherman who's been in Greek-speaking lands for a while now could come up with. A number of scholars, including Randy Richards, I mentioned earlier, who's done a lot of evangelical, who's done a lot of work on letter writing in antiquity, said no, the exact phrase that Peter uses there every other time we find it refers to a letter carrier or a courier, a mailman. This is probably not likely a reference to an amanuensis. Well, if that is true, it still doesn't preclude Peter from having used an amanuensis in the one letter and not in the other. Just means we don't know his name, or maybe Silas did both. That's not an impossibility. I understand the problems associated with it being Peter, but at the end of the day, yeah, I think somehow it was Peter.
Very helpful. This is from the Great Wa. He asks, "What made you
these names?"
Yeah, I've told him the same before. What made you pursue this area of study, New Testament studies, instead of focusing on another aspect of the Christian faith?"
Well, the area of my studies was not textual criticism. I don't know if somehow you guys thought that was the case. I've become a decent amateur at talking about it. The area of my interest was historical reliability of the New Testament. And when I went to Aberdeen and said I wanted to do that, my very gracious, kind professor said, yeah, that's a nice thing to talk about down the road, but could you pick one small area for now? And after a long conversation, we ended up with parables, which is why I've done a lot of work in that area as well. But it goes back to after my conversion at age 15 and attempting to share my faith, high school, college years with lots of different people, discovering that it wasn't enough to quote either Josh McDowell or C.S. Lewis and talk about Jesus is either liar, lunatic, or Lord, because there's a fourth L that most people prefer, legend, that the story isn't reliable in the first place. And to make McDowell's and Lewis's arguments work, you have to assume that the Gospels are accurate. And I thought, yeah. And everything I had learned in church and in the parachurch world was being questioned in my classes that I took. My New Testament professor loved to preface statements with, "No serious scholar believes." And that was his way of saying that I was quoting an evangelical idea that was out to lunch. And that's really what got me interested in the field in the first place.
It's funny you mentioned Josh McDowell because I know like he has been active since the 70s, but to his credit, he has been updating his work over the years. What do you think of using the latest edition of Evidence That Demands a Verdict?
I think it's wonderful. There, it may sound funny to some people, but because I was weaned on his Evidence That Demands a Verdict and More Evidence That Demands a Verdict in the 70s, to have him through his son Sean contact me and ask if I would read over some of the chapters where in fact he had quoted from some of the things I have done was really one of the bigger honors I've received in my life, though there wouldn't be anybody else in the world that would rank that up there with some other honors that I've received. I think they have done their homework, and I think the third and most recent edition not only is gargantuan compared to what they started out with, and covers a lot of topics that they didn't start out with, but I think it's just a very, very helpful resource.
There's another question here about Nina Levicy's book. Have you read it? And if not, do you know any books supporting the 7 Pauline letters in depth?
I am not familiar with Nina. Are you?
I haven't heard. Lewis, do you know? Okay, yeah.
Negative.
If one of you wants to Google it or Amazon it real quickly.
Yeah. Let me try to see if I can pull it up. And while I do that, Lewis, if you had any follow-up questions for anything there, because I'm going to try to see.
Yeah. Let me see if I have any. So you mentioned that your story about how you got into New Testament reliability. I don't know. This is more of a comment rather than a question, really. I think the reason why a lot of the discussion revolves around textual criticism is because, well, first, Bart Ehrman made the topic popular 20 years ago,
Sure.
with misquoting Jesus. The other one is because I deal a lot with Muslims, and a lot of Christian apologists these days also deal with a lot of Muslims. And one of the things I notice is Muslims love to use textual criticism when attacking the Bible. They will quote Bart Ehrman and similar scholars to undermine the reliability of the Gospels.
And we need to become more familiar with the small but emerging discipline of textual criticism of the Quran, because it is simply a false statement to say that the Quran was perfectly preserved from the beginning. There were multiple copies, all but one of which were destroyed after Muhammad's death. And the standard apologetic reply is, well, they had such minor differences that there wasn't any need to keep the others. Is that demonstrable? Or is that just a guess that you would like to be true? Or were there enough differences that you couldn't accept one and still accept another, so you had to limit things down? We'll never know. But then even from that point on, although this is not what popular level Islam tells its people, there are both Christian and a handful of Islamic scholars who are prepared to say there are minor differences that emerge. No, not on the scale that you get with the New Testament, but the scale is not the question. The reason that it's on a bigger scale with the New Testament is because we have so many thousands more documents. It's what we should expect. Once you acknowledge one variant anywhere, then that destroys the claim of inerrant preservation, which is not what Christianity has ever claimed. And then finally, let's suppose a document was inerrantly preserved. Preservation of a document has no relationship to its truth. I can take The Lord of the Rings and with modern technology ensure that 1 million copies are created that don't have a single difference from whatever I give them. And that does not turn The Lord of the Rings into sober history. It was written as a novel. It remains a novel. And so there's a lot of fuzzy thinking among Christians as well as people of other faiths here. If we had a perfectly preserved, exactly original copy of every book of the Bible, it wouldn't make a word of it true. What it would do is give us wonderful knowledge of what the original claims were, and then we could go to see if it could be defended historically.
Yeah, I think the problem with talking about Quranic textual criticism is it just isn't as well developed as New Testament textual criticism. Right. Like the discipline has not been around as long, so a lot of the things we can say about it are still tentative. Right. Yeah.
There is a follow-up here from Michael E. He says that Nina argues that Paul didn't write any of the letters.
Oh, my.
There you go. So, yeah.
Who is she? Is she a scholar?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. Let's see if I can find out where she teaches at, if anywhere.
The only people I know who will deny that St. Paul wrote any letters, correct me if I'm wrong, are generally Jesus mythicists.
Well, I don't know why they would have to deny Paul, because they're often some of the people that call Paul the original founder of Christianity.
Good point.
So looks like she's professor emerita of religious studies at OU College of Professional and Continuing Studies, University of Oklahoma. So,
yeah.
So someone who taught in the general area of religion, and
she says her training
can't tell from that what her specialty or specialization
She says her training is in biblical studies with a specialization in Pauline letters, University of Oklahoma, professor of religious studies in Emerita.
So I mean, you will find in every generation, you will find outliers. In every decade, you will find outliers. You already alluded to the fact that there are people who seriously think Jesus never existed.
Right.
There are people who seriously think he was an alien. In fact, I had a conversation back in the 90s, an extended conversation. I was naive enough to think I might be able to make a difference in this guy's life. He was a retired professor of meteorology from one of the state universities in Oregon. I don't want to misspeak. I don't remember if it was OSU or the University of Oregon. A distinguished scientific career. And he had actually published a book with a reputable university press arguing that a Gnostic-like mystical document that came out of medieval Germany, which sounded somewhat like the Gospel of Matthew, except for all the important places, was the original gospel, and that Jesus was deposited here by aliens from outer space. And the guy had a credible scientific career. I don't understand how people do these things.
This reminds me of John Allegro, who's a scholar in the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Yes,
who argued that Jesus was a mushroom, from what I gather.
way back when. That was in the 60s. Yeah.
There's some
I
wild
have,
stuff out there.
yeah. One of the things I noticed about geomythicism is that in the academy it's very rare, but in internet atheist circles it's
Yes.
surprisingly
Yes.
common.
Yes.
Like, I don't understand the discrepancy. These are the same people who are all about logic and reason, but they go against the historical consensus on this particular topic.
Logic and reason, when it's convenient, when it matches what you want to believe, but only then. Yeah.
Offbeat question here. Did you know the late Dr. Bruce Metzger by any chance?
I met him on a couple of occasions. I can't say that I knew him. We had him in Denver once. We joined together with a couple of other schools of theology to host him as a speaker back in the early 90s, I think it was. And I was astonished when I introduced myself to him that he actually recognized my name from about the only two things I had written at that point in time. But I can't say that I knew him.
So he was on his P's and Q's.
Or maybe pies and, well, there is no Q in Greek.
Yes.
But,
The one thing that I would really be curious to know is how much of the stuff that his most famous student Bart Ehrman is saying these days, Metzger would have agreed with him on.
not much.
Not much.
It's very interesting to read the latest, I want to say 4th edition, I'm not entirely sure of that, of Metzger's introduction, major introduction to New Testament textual criticism, because it was finished after he passed away and Bart edited it. And to Bart's credit, he pretty much stayed faithful, a few minor differences here and there, to the spirit of Metzger's previous editions. And if you read that, and that's the first thing you ever see Bart Ehrman's name on, you'll go, oh, this is very responsible.
Somebody said that Metzger called Ehrman Bad Bart. I don't know where that was, but that'd be pretty fascinating if true.
Don't know that one.
Anyways, Dr. Blomberg, this was such an honor to have you on. Hey, you are always welcome to come back on the show. We thank you so much for your time, your expertise. We are so grateful for you coming on. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
This was absolutely fascinating. And Louis, thank you so much for joining with these very, very thoughtful questions. Everybody hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. I'll see you next time. God bless.